Welcome to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now, a weekly podcast looking at Israel and the region and the world at large. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with our senior analyst, Haviv Rettig Gur. Hi, Haviv. Thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Amanda. It's good to be here.
It is so great to let you virtually into my home. And as you can probably hear, there's a kindergarten next door, which brings a lot of joy to life. But we are going to talk about the Trump administration, which a lot of people here in Israel are really counting on to bring even more joy of life into Israel. I don't know if if it's a false dream, some kind of, hope that we're pinning everything onto, but we're going to talk about the different 7 fronts of the war and what we kind of expect from the Trump administration in each of these different fronts. But all of that, of course, because I'm here with Haviv Rettig Gur, ties into an overarching theory. So here you go, right, Haviv? First off, I think most people have really been impressed or at least startled by what Trump has been saying about the hostages. And of course, the incoming U.S. envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, announced on Tuesday that he will be traveling to Doha later this week. And he said that a hostage deal being mediated by Qatar is on the verge of completion, as U.S. President-elect Donald Trump again warned, quote, "All hell will break loose in the region if the hostages are not let go, if there is no agreement between Israel and Hamas by the inauguration on January 20th. All eyes are on January 20th. So, Haviv, we all know that Trump likes to talk tough, but do you think there will be some action behind these words?
That's a great question. Will the Americans be able to do great damage to Hamas and Hamas's allies in the region? Can they pressure Qatar? Can they lean on Egypt? Can they lean on those who can lean on Hamas? Possibly. The problem with pressuring Hamas at this point is that they don't have much to lose anymore. They have lost Gaza. They are now a very weakened guerrilla force in Gaza that can harass the Israeli lines, but can't really take over the place again. And there's a point where I think Israel has already won in Gaza. And what I mean by that, because the great debate over victory or non-victory in Gaza is what the heck anybody means when they say the word. What I mean by that is there is no way to run Gaza, to rebuild and rehabilitate Gaza, to develop any kind of political future for Gaza worth having, as long as Hamas remains. And that's true if you love Israel, and it's true if you hate Israel. If you think the Israelis are evil, and if you think the Israelis are good, it doesn't matter. If you dump $100 billion into Gaza tomorrow to rebuild it, and Hamas manages that money, Gaza will not be rebuilt in 10 years. What will be in Gaza is another round of war, and the battlefield created out of that civilian population and out of those cities for yet more war. Hamas has already, it's a sunk cost problem. Hamas has already destroyed so much, knowingly, purposefully, planning on the altar of this being, this sort of Algeria strategy being the correct strategy, that it can never pivot from it. And so what kind of pressure can you bring on? It's essentially the Houthi problem in Yemen that America has, right? What kind of pressure can you bring on a group that's okay with its own society burning to the ground? And that's, I think, a fantastic and interesting question, and a tragic one and a horrible one, but nevertheless the one that we face. And I think that the answer is that Hamas belongs to a much larger ideological movement, ideological axis. The Muslim Brothers, the Islamist restorationists who believe that the destruction of Israel is the beginning of Islam's return from 500 years of weakness. And if you can threaten them with the defeat of that, then the ideological brethren of Hamas will have some capacity to pressure it. But that means America has to pressure Qatar and Turkey in ways that Qatar and Turkey feel deeply. Egypt in ways that Egypt feels deeply. America has a few levers over Qatar, a few levers over Egypt, not that many levers over Turkey. So I don't know what Trump thinks he's going to do, but if America is serious about this, and it isn't just Trump talking tough, then that could reshape the Middle East in the service of just squeezing Hamas.
What is really confusing to me, Haviv, throughout even the race for the presidency, is that on the one hand, Trump ran on an America First platform, meaning he didn't want America to be involved in all these different wars that are happening here. And on the other hand, it's almost inevitable in a way because of this overarching theory, the zoom out, and it's the US versus China and Russia. And so all of us here in this region, at least, are in a way proxies of that war. And so you have to wonder, how much of a microcosm are we living in? And will Trump actually pay attention to this in terms of his overarching, global concerns?
I think so. I mean, you're exactly right. Every single conflict Israel has with each piece of the larger Iranian proxy system or its various Islamist Sunni enemies, every single one is itself complex and has history and has sort of deep strategy, and everybody's sort of playing shadow boxing kinds of games. And all of that is a tiny piece of a larger international global puzzle that intervenes profoundly. It matters tremendously that America has 2,000 troops in eastern Syria with the Syrian Democratic Forces and the Kurds. It matters tremendously that France and America have real influence in Lebanon, hard influence that they're using now to try and make sure the ceasefire works. It matters tremendously that the Americans could essentially, with the push of a button, bankrupt the Revolutionary Guard Corps by closing all the loopholes in energy sanctions that allow the Revolutionary Guard Corps to continue to draw foreign currency from the Iranian energy sector. So the international questions, the international scene, the fact that Russia buys Iranian drones for the Ukraine war, it's all intertwined. They're all, you can look at it to tiny level and you can zoom out to 5,000 feet and then 15,000 feet and then 30,000 feet. And at each level and layer, there's a whole new level of complexity. So that is to say, it's not simple, but in all of the layers and complexities, there are certain clear and shining simplicities in which Israeli interests and American interests overlap perfectly. And that's not all Israeli interests overlap with American interests. I don't think Israel and America have the same interests in Syria, in this weird new Syria. But in certain places, America and Israel intersect totally. And the main one, of course, is Iran. Israel doesn't want an Iranian nuke. And if there is an Iranian nuke, then American interests with Russia, American interests in Ukraine, American interests in Europe, American interests throughout the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Syria, all these places where America does have a little bit of interest here, a little bit of interest there, global energy markets, all of that will be fundamentally reshaped. And so American-Israeli interest in preventing an Iranian bomb is an overwhelming and powerful thing. European defense spending. Europeans are adorably increasing their defense spending from 1.4% of GDP average across the EU. Since Putin invaded Ukraine 2 years ago, it's now gone up to 2%, which again, I thank you, great job, well done, Europeans. Russia is spending 8% of its GDP on its military. And so it's just not there yet. It's not at a place where Europe can push back. A European-American constellation that defends the democracies in the world, right, doesn't depend on the UN to defend freedom. The democracies of this world are a minority of the United Nations. But if Europe and America are actually allied and serious about being able to project power, it's a much safer world. And it's a world in which Israel has to fear Iran less. And it's a world in which the Middle East seeks development rather than war because war is less likely. So there are these enormous things, which I think, frankly, these are Trump's instincts. Don't let the Ayatollahs have a nuke. Get the Europeans to pay for their own defense and make it real. Make it a real serious military capacity by democratic Europe. And advancing the Abraham Accords. Never mind the talk of peace and love and joy and happiness. The Abraham Accords are fundamentally a defensive alliance, and they're literally everywhere in the Middle East, a defensive alliance of America's closest allies. And so build that out and give the Saudis their defense agreement, protect the Kurds, who will join in a larger Abraham Accords kind of defensive superstructure in the service of essentially American interests in the Middle East as well as Israeli and Saudi. So yes, there are huge overlaps of policy. There are huge things that America needs in the Middle East and from Israel and from the region, and they overlap perfectly with Israel. Not all the interests, not everything is going to be on the same page, but there's so much that the Trump administration could do to reshape this region in their interest, that I think we should expect to see. I hope to expect to see some of that. The only question really is how much of that does the new American administration understand is in America's interests and choose to move forward on.
Now, with Biden, we had, in my opinion, a lot of micromanaging of the Gaza war and a lot of, holdups. We've discussed this several times on the podcast because of threatening to reduce arms shipments or all sorts of different reasons. But one of the things that the United States has made very clear is that they want Israel to work on the day after. And of course, Israel has no interest in allowing Hamas or even the Palestinian Authority to be part of this day after. And so the question that I often wonder when I'm thinking about Trump is how hands-on is he going to be about these different things? Gaza the day after, that's a huge topic. And we're really at a stalemate right now. We really don't have any plan on the ground to rule Gaza. And of course, most Israelis, not all Israelis, do not want to be in Gaza when the war ends. And most Israelis, not all Israelis, but most Israelis actually do want to see the war to end. So how hands-on do you think that Trump will be in terms of Gaza the day after?
It's possible, I suspect, that Trump could actually, by having less of a hands-on policy toward Gaza, really move the needle in a very important way. We have known for a long time that the ultimate defeat of Hamas will need a day after scenario. In other words, the great problem in Gaza, the deep problem, is that there is no Gaza that isn't Hamas, politically speaking. Obviously, there are ordinary people who don't agree with Hamas in huge numbers of them. We have polls on this. But unlike in Lebanon, where when you crush Hezbollah, there's all the rest of Lebanese politics that can begin to agonizingly debate whether it's going to come in and fill that vacuum. In Gaza, there isn't any other political force, right? Hamas ruled Gaza for 17 years. Half the Gazan population is under 18. Hamas ran the school system. So Gazan Islam is Hamas's Islam. Gazan culture is Hamas's culture. Every minority and every other branch and every other idea and has all been crushed under Hamas. And all of that went through this war. So what's left? What political forces, what social structures are left to fill in the vacuum? And the answer is almost, very little. And so now the question becomes, Israel needs to continue the fight in Gaza to degrade Hamas. There's no military analyst who has looked at Gaza and said anything else could possibly work. Again, if Hamas isn't crushed, and by the way, those who argue Israel cannot crush Hamas in Gaza, for not in 30 years, are arguing that Gaza will never recover. So I hope they're wrong. I deeply hope they're wrong. If Israel can destroy Hamas, then the question becomes what fills in the gap. And many have argued, I have argued, you have argued, that getting a day after idea out there, getting people to perceive that there will be a day, that Israel agrees to a day, that Bezalel Smotrich's dream of settling Gaza is not the Israeli plan, will make it easier to get a day after Arab involvement in Gaza. That'll make it easier to crush Hamas now. That'll make everything faster and everything more efficient and everything better. Netanyahu has had an argument that has made this argument that he cannot tell the world what will be the day after in Gaza for a very simple reason, because it's a political Pandora's box, and it'll still be another year, maybe 2, maybe 8 months. I don't know the timeline, but somewhere in that range of this degradation war, of this sort of anti-guerrilla degradation war, the likes very similar to what America did against ISIS in northern Iraq in the middle of the last decade. And that took 5 years. And so it's just going to take time to degrade Hamas's forces. And if we now announce, Mazel Tov, Saudi Arabia, you're coming in the day after, and you're the day after. Thank you so much for de-radicalizing Gaza. We've solved this problem. Well, that means that every day between now and then, the Saudis have to look publicly like they're serving Gaza's interests. They have to open for themselves a political window to actually step in, so they can't be riding in on an Israeli tank. So they have to face the Israelis, and they have to challenge the Israelis, and they have to make it much harder for the Israelis Israelis to win the war, and they have to put exactly the kind of pressure on the Israelis that will make Hamas think it should keep fighting. And so Netanyahu says, if I now declare an ally on the day after who will come in, first of all, I undermine that ally. Second of all, I make winning that harder and push that day after farther. That is a serious argument. That is a serious argument. The only problem with Netanyahu's argument is that very few people believe him. And very few people believe him because it just happens to overlap with his desperate political need not to upset Ben-Gvir and Smotrich in his coalition. And so maybe he doesn't want to talk about a day after now, not for strategic reasons, but in fact for domestic political reasons. And then that means that we're not going to reach a quick resolution of the war for his political reasons, not going to reach a day after for his political. There won't be a point where he won't prefer Smotrich and Ben-Gvir at his side. And so he's using that good strategic excuse, going to stretch us to the point where he's going to just continue with other excuses. And the real reason is political. I don't know to tell you what's in Netanyahu's soul. I don't know if he won't talk about a day after because of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich or because he doesn't want to undermine the possibility of an Arab involvement the day after. I do know that I do believe that Netanyahu is capable, if he decided that was the right thing to do, of figuring out a way to dance between those raindrops, to thread that needle, to say, I'm not going to say what the day after is going to be, but it is not going to be Israeli settlement. I'm not going to say what the day after is going to be for very important strategic reasons, because it begins the day after Hamas, but it is not going to be permanent Israeli control. Those are sentences that could be said. Those are sentences the Saudis, the Americans can latch onto. Those are sentences that Netanyahu can be held to account for if that's not true. And if he does that, then he opens these political windows to move forward on Abraham Accords, on all the other things the Trump administration would like to see, but which Gaza is kind of the stopper or the cork in the wine bottle that's preventing anything from moving forward. It is possible that a Trump that gets much more hands-off, doesn't say, do go into Rafah, don't go into Rafah, all that stuff the Biden administration did, that now Biden administration officials, famously Blinken in the New York Times interview this week, or was it last week, where they're suddenly saying, all those times we pressured Israel, it just pushed Hamas away from the negotiating. It just prolonged the war. Well, as we say in Hebrew, good morning, Elijah, right? Where have you been, right? This is extremely obvious what you're now discovering about how you mishandled this. So Trump doesn't have to ride shotgun on this war, doesn't want to ride shotgun on this war. But if he could open up, just squeeze Netanyahu a little bit while offering Netanyahu tremendous boons on things where our interests totally overlap, like Iran. Squeeze Netanyahu with that leverage a little bit and force something of a day after, the shadow of a figment of a day after, which will cost Netanyahu politically, but Netanyahu can make the excuse in domestic Israeli politics that Trump is squeezing him. What's he supposed to do? Netanyahu's very good at using that excuse. He used it just about every single day of the Obama administration to his right-wing allies. Squeeze that out of him and crack open a little crack of the political window that the Saudis need to move ahead on the Israeli-Saudi alliance and to move ahead on the de-radicalization of Gaza down the road, which is the absolute necessary precondition for Gaza's rehabilitation and reconstruction.
I agree with you that a lot of what we've been seeing is very performative. And I want to turn a little bit to the Abraham Accords, because if you remember back in the day, years ago, when this was solidified, the annexation of the West Bank was on the table, or was definitely in the air. There was no actual legislation being passed, as far as I remember. But the use of the annexation was one of the levers that the U.S. used in order to solidify the Abraham Accords. Now, if you're talking about the Gaza Strip, I think, as you rightly said, Netanyahu coming out again to say that there should be no settlement, because he has discussed that in the past. He has said that he is against settlement of Gaza in the past. So him coming out again and saying that could go a long way towards this. But I do wonder as well, if we're talking about, the annexation of the West Bank, which is, of course, in the air here in Israel as well, because you look at the lineup that Trump has assembled for his aides and envoys and ambassador, and everyone is wondering, is now the time? And I wonder if this could also be a way to get the Israeli public on board with whatever day after scenario may be taking place in Gaza. What do you think?
I really have no idea. I don't know what the Trump administration feels it can do, what it wants its legacy to be, what the Israeli quid pro quo would be for that, for the annexation, how much the annexation would be. There's some small bit of the West Bank that Israel legally, in its own law, views as annexed, especially mainly areas of municipal Jerusalem. But not, is there going to be recognition of that? That kind of was in the first Trump administration. Is there? Look, if Israel annexes roughly 15% of the West Bank, maybe even less, it solves 85%. I'm spitballing here, but these are very sort of educated guess kind of numbers. These are relatively the numbers. 85% of the settlement problem. Which is to say, how do you build any kind of Palestinian autonomy that is in any way contiguous, given certain sections of the settlement movement that lie right in between Palestinian population centers? I think that 15%, right, rough number, is deep within the Israeli consensus. And I don't think Israelis think that that's going to be removed. And I don't think that, is that where they're moving forward? Or are they talking about annexing 60% of the West Bank, which is the entirety of Area C, which is under Israeli military and civilian control? And then you're talking about literally all the pathways between all the Palestinian cities. And it's a whole different ballgame. And it's a whole different level of, it's a whole different future in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian. Now, would the Trump administration go down that road? How would that help them achieve their goals on Iran, on Saudi Arabia, in the oil markets, in this, I think the Trump administration is eager. It's a little bit like what happens in the Muslim world, and it's a little bit like what happens everywhere. When your political opponent has lost, has failed in the great vision, it makes it more valuable for you to succeed. In other words, you could abandon the vision completely, right? The Biden administration was silly to think that there could be anything but war in the Middle East. So we're not even going to pretend that we care about peace or any kind of reconciliation or moving forward. Or, well, they failed to make peace, but if we succeed, well, we've shown them, right? Those Democrats. That probably is the dynamic that will come into play, which is to say, I suspect Trump will want peace, will want to show an expansion of the Abraham Accords, will want to show the first serious effort in a decade to move forward on the Israeli-Palestinian question, beyond the question of the war, will want to show that the destruction of Hamas is an effective way forward for a better future for Palestinians, not a worse one. I don't think Trump would turn down a legacy of being thought of as the man who actually finally saved Palestine, not only from the evil Israelis in the view of the Palestinians, but even from all of the deeply dysfunctional, kleptocratic, tyrannical, and viciously violent and redemptionist, restorationist, Islamist kinds of movements that constantly destroy Palestine and drive it into a brick wall. So why not, right? I suspect we're going to see a Trump deeply on Israel's side and also kind of eager to make a peace. And Israel will have to play carefully in that arena because, if he wants peace too much, he won't have it. But if he can crush the enemies of peace on that side, he will have levers of influence within Israel to also deliver the Israelis to the table. There's a potential there. If I had to bet my pension on whether it would work or not, I would bet that it will not. But I can see the interest and I can see the potential. And dafka, as we say in Hebrew, how do you translate dafka?
There's no translation for dafka, but intentionally and very purposefully and unexpectedly and forever on.
Yeah, precisely the one who you wouldn't expect it from based on the sort of conventional wisdom view of this conflict, which I have never agreed with, the Western conventional wisdom on this conflict, but just Dafka, the one who is not hewing to that conventional wisdom, might be the one who has the most capacity to actually deliver something.
I agree that Israel wants peace and Israelis definitely want peace, but I think Israelis are increasingly convinced that the only way to get peace is to make a more serious war. And that is, of course, on Iran itself. And the question many have looking forward to this January 20th inauguration is, okay, will the US be party to this? Will the US turn away, meaning allow Israel to take care of this problem? Or what will be the US's role here?
Let me lay it out first from the Israeli side, then from the American side. It's not complicated. It's things that we all know and have known for some time. Israel has very specific needs on the Iranian front. It has to set a new status quo. Iran built out a proxy system whose fundamental purpose is to exact massive costs from Israel over time and no cost to Iran. And what Israel has done beautifully over the last 15 months, but especially over the last 3 months, is drive those costs directly to Iran, smash proxies in ways that are massively costly to Iran itself. Now the Iranian regime has to explain to a people going through some terrible winter storms without natural gas and without heat why it spent $30 billion that the Iranian economy doesn't have on proxy systems to destroy a country it has no border with and no interests in, but only this religious redemptionist vision of destroying. Israel needs to up those costs. In other words, we are now stuck in a war with the Houthis. Well, you can't bomb the Houthis, okay? Yemen was starved to the point of 250,000 starvation deaths just like 5 years ago, and the Houthis didn't care. There was nothing you could do to Yemen that would make the Houthis care. The Houthis are of a type with Hezbollah and Hamas. They're willing to have their own countries burned to the ground in a war for honor and redemption. But less competent than Hamas and Hezbollah. So they're not deterrable because they don't care if their own people die. And so you bomb Hodeidah and you bomb their oil sector. And so now they don't have foreign currency and their own currency is collapsing. And so what? They don't care. They will continue to fight. Well, guess what? The Houthis don't build their own missiles. The Houthis don't have the capacity to pave roads. They're not building the ballistic missiles that they're launching. Those are Iranian missiles. So take the fight to Iran. Every Houthi missile that hits Israel, the new status quo Israel has to set is that a Houthi missile that hits Israel immediately translates into an Israeli strike on Iranian soil. There needs to be that escalation. Iran lives on not having Western escalation or Israeli escalation against it. That's how that regime survives and builds out never-ending war. So the escalation has to be brought home to the regime. That's Israel's basic fundamental need. It's true with Iraqi militias attacks on Israel, which, by the way, has stopped. The Iraqi militias have announced that it stopped because they saw what happened to Hezbollah, and they don't want to happen to them what happened to the Houthis. Where does America come in on Iran? Israel needs, just one last point, Israel needs to show Iran defeated, not just to know that Iran can't strike it and cause terrible damage, and Israel can strike Iran, not just to know that we have escalation dominance. Everyone everywhere has to see that we have escalation dominance. And Iran, therefore, has to slink back into its cave and reconsider its options. And if that humiliates the regime in front of its own people and reveals the actual deep fragility of this regime, God created in Iran an almost perfect target for rediscovery of Israeli strength. The entire energy sector owned by the IRGC, or they own 50% of the oil industry in Iran, of the oil infrastructure, it's all accessible from the air. In other words, it's like, all these ways that the IRGC and the Iranian proxy system fund themselves are destroyable easily by the Israelis alone without any American help. Okay, now if that's not, you know what I mean? I'm the son of a rabbi, but I don't claim to know God's mind. But if that's not a statement about what could be the future in the coming year for the Iranian proxy system, I don't know what is. Why the heck not? Why the heck not do it? What do we need from the Americans? Trump is not going to put boots on the ground. Trump is not going to get massively invested in a Middle Eastern war. That is the one lesson that all the Americans from all sides of the political spectrum drew from the last 30 years. But we discovered 2 months ago something astonishing. We discovered that the Americans actually have extremely good intelligence tracking of Iran's oil smuggling to bypass sanctions, smuggling its oil to China. There's a pipeline from Iran to, I believe, Oman, which is a natural gas pipeline, again, to skirt sanctions. Some significant percentage of Iraqi oil exports are actually Iranian oil. funneled through the Iraqi system to skirt sanctions. America knows all of this. It knows that Iran skirts sanctions. And you know what? You can pivot the sanctions to cover those sneaky ways that Iran continues to bring in foreign currency, the Iranian revolutionary elements of the regime, the IRGC, not the Iranian economy. You can seal up all of those enormous gaps, enormous lacunae, with the push of a button. In Washington. And to prevent the Israelis from bombing the Iranian energy sector a few months ago, the Americans actually did that. The Treasury Department issued a notice that it was sanctioning the tankers that are taking Iran, smuggling that Iranian oil around the sanctions over to China. And that drove up the cost of insurance for those tankers, those sanctions, and those tankers for some period of time, I don't remember if it was 2 weeks or 5 weeks, whatever it was, China wouldn't buy because the oil cost too much and the tankers weren't shipping Iranian oil. It's doable. And it's easy. And so America needs to get serious about the sanctions. And it needs to actually crush not the Iranian economy, but the regime economy, the IRGC-owned energy sector. And that's their Achilles heel. And if America does that, then the Iranian regime stumbles, genuinely, profoundly stumbles. Every time there's a protest by the people of Iran. And it's often about women's rights. It's often about women's headwear. Why? Because the Iranian society is literally secularizing in its hatred of the regime. Well, every time that happens, one of the great military forces of the regime, this besieged popular militia, takes to the streets to crush the revolt. They're going to have a hard time funding the besiege if you crush them with sanctions economically, if you squeeze them economically that way. Let the Israelis do the fighting. But if America gets serious about sanctions, then we can all have everything that we want. And how do you handle a breakout? Then things might get kinetic. Things might get into a war. If Israel alone tries to bomb the Iranian nuclear program, a lot of it will survive. If it does it with America, a lot less of it will survive. But those are questions down the road if Iran ever takes that path. We can destabilize that regime to the point where it is terrified for its existence, and we can do it easily. And we can do it with America doing nothing but pushing buttons in Washington and the Israelis bearing the brunt of the actual conflict. And I think that if Trump gives us that, he can have anything else on any front he wants. That's the big existential question for Israel today. You came for us. You tried to kill us. You tried to do it with this clever ring of fire proxy strategy. You thought that you could slowly escalate, blah, blah, blah. That will bring you down. That crushed you. The Shia Islamist version of the same war to destroy us that Arab nationalists under Nasser tried out in the 50s. Well, we have steadily demolished Middle Eastern ideology after Middle Eastern ideology. First, it was the pan-Arabism of Nasser because they failed in the battlefield. And then it was Yasser Arafat's Algeria anti-colonial terrorism strategy, and we crushed it. And then it was this newest Islamist idea, this Islamist strategy. And the Islamists are telling the Middle East, we hearken back to Islam and Islam's origins and first generations and piety, and therefore we will do what all you secular ideologies failed to do. Well, let's crush it and give the Arabs a chance to come up with new ideologies that are not defining Arab honor on our destruction and might even actually build an Arab world worth living in. We have to crush it. And if Trump gives us that and backs us up on that, that's the grand strategy. That's the great story moving forward. Then it's a new day, not for Israel. Israel's a small little bit of this place. It's a new day for the Middle East. Israel's the excuse they're using to take over the Arab world generally. Let's crush this Islamist imperialism. Let's do it because they came for our kids. Let's do it for the whole entirety of the Middle East. It'll cost America nothing and deliver tremendous gains for everything America wants to see in this region.
It sounds almost like a Jewish holiday. They came to destroy us. They didn't succeed. Now let's eat. But my one question for you, Haviv, is when you've cornered the lunatic, which is this Islamist Iranian regime, when you've cornered them with these sanctions and they really have nowhere to go, Are they going to be using options that most sane leadership wouldn't even consider, namely the nuclear option? And that, I think, is the big fear, which is driving Israel. I mean, especially Netanyahu for what, 15 years, who has been talking about how you have to simply crush the ability of the Iranians to even have any kind of nuclear option. But I just worry that if the nuclear option is not taken out before these sanctions are put in place, which will destabilize the regime and create this cornered lunatic, that the world will pay the price.
Before October 7, Israel's fundamental strategy on all fronts against all problems and enemies was delay, was threat postponement, because it was never worth it. Who knows what threats disappear of their own, right? We have enemies that destroy their own societies. So Hezbollah is demolishing Lebanese competence, the competence of the Lebanese state. Maybe it'll all collapse in on its own and we won't ever have to fight the terrible, debilitating war against Hezbollah that Nasrallah and Iran were preparing for us. Delay. Since Hamas took over Gaza in 2007, Israel's GDP per capita doubled. We have now a higher GDP per capita than the United Kingdom. So that delaying strategy seemed wise. And then October 7 happened. And then we looked around and we saw just how much Iran had built out that ring of fire. And we understood that Iran's fundamental strategy for destroying us, which is part of a much larger story of a Shia restorationism that brings Islam and redeems Islam and showing it to the Sunni because they failed to destroy Israel, but now the Shia will succeed, and that proves that the Shia are right and the Sunni are wrong. They don't want to destroy us because they know anything about us. They don't care about us. We are a cartoon in this vast moral narrative, a cartoon antagonist that they have built out in their own heads, and they want to destroy us for a certain story that's playing out in their minds. And they were absolutely serious about it and were willing to invest vast resources that they didn't have in it and were willing to destroy whole nations to do it. And that's when we discovered and concluded and realized that threat postponement no longer works. The only strategy that matters is threat prevention. Anything the Ayatollahs have, they will use. They don't build it out not to use it. And we thought that Hezbollah was a deterrent against us. And it wasn't. They were planning to use it. And we thought that all the things they had built out, everywhere they built them out, was to deter us. It wasn't. They were planning to use it. And so an Ayatollah with a nuke is not like Khrushchev with a nuke. They're planning to use it. They will use it only when they feel like they might be able to get away with it, when they might be able to do so much nuclear bombardment that there won't be anyone in Israel to push the return button to launch an Israeli nuke at them, allegedly according to foreign sources. But they will use it. So I submit to you that the days of threat postponement are gone. I'm sorry to the Middle East. I know it was a lot of fun while the Israelis were postponing threats and you guys could build a lot of stuff out. Iran is a fundamentally fragile, ridiculously fragile regime. The only trick it has up its sleeve is building that nuke. And it is a regime that crushed Syria, carried out genocide in Syria, allowed and augmented and bolstered and pushed for the death of hundreds of thousands in Yemen. It is a regime willing to sink the Middle East in oceans of blood for its vision of Islamic redemption. And they're going to have a nuke. And so, no, this is it. We took out their air defense systems. We showed how fragile they really are. All of their great problem, dictators are always an illusion. They're a kind of mirage they build up around themselves of power to scare everybody. And they're always weaker than they look. We did not ourselves realize just how much weaker they actually are. But they cannot today stop us from doing what needs to be done. They simply can't, even if they try. And even if they turn on everything they have, they can't. Why did Giuliani manage to break out of Idlib and take Damascus? For a very simple reason. When Assad was threatened back in 13 or 14, when did Hezbollah begin to be deployed in a serious way with Iran coming in to save Assad? One of those years. Hezbollah was Iran's main deployable force in the region. And we destroyed Hezbollah's capacity to operate as that mobile commando crack unit. And then nothing could stop a fairly competent Sunni force breaking out, running down Hama and Homs, that road that cut off the Alawite heartland on the coast from Damascus, and the Assad regime was toast instantly because it was weak, and the only thing holding it up, at the cost of 600,000 dead Sunnis and millions of refugees, and the collapse of Syria's ancient Christian community, which was 10% of the population of Syria in 2011, and today is less than 2%, all of that cataclysm that the Middle East is undergoing in multiple countries, Iran enables or actively commits, actually does. And they're fragile. So why? Why let them continue to destroy nations? Why let them continue to build a nuke that the new doctrine that Israel adheres to is that they will use? Trump is coming in. If they break out to that bomb, and it's not instant, it's not a week, they don't have the technology to actually put it on a warhead. It's one thing to actually be able to detonate a bomb. It's a whole other thing to be able to actually launch it. We have a window. I submit to you, if we don't use it, we've handed the Ayatollahs the only actual thing that will make them not fragile, and they very well might use it. And so, no, the new theory, the new doctrine is threat removal, not threat postponement. And this is the biggest of them, and it has to be removed. And when we do that, the Russians won't have drones in Ukraine. And China won't have some of the sneaky, not very high quality, but nevertheless oil that, won't be able to thumb its nose at America, at least in the Middle East, so easily. We will remove a piece of a vast axis against America, and we will save ourselves from having to deal with a future nuclearized Middle East. Why not?
Haviv, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Amanda.
Thanks for listening to The Times of Israel's What Matters Now. Please join us again next week for another installment. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next week, shalom.